Welcome to Princeton TV. Dr. Munoz is joining us today from RAND Corporation. We're tracking this story in Boston with the twin bombing at the marathon. Can you tell us something about what may have happened here?
Well, we really don't know at this point. I mean, it's too early to speculate. It could be foreign terrorism. It could be domestic terrorism. The authorities have been very careful to avoid using the word suspect, because I'm sure you've read in the newspaper about there's a person of interest that's being investigated.
You mean the
authorities are very careful not to call them.
Go ahead. The Saudi foreign student, you mean, who was at the scene, who's now in a hospital. I think he had damage to his hands or something, and
that is correct.
Yeah.
But they've been very careful not to call him a suspect. So at this point, we really don't know if it's domestic foreign terrorism.
Okay. Now, but we know, right, factually, it's the case that since post 9/11, we have been conducting surveillance on foreign students, especially from Islamic countries. So if there was a lead or a tip or some sort of a, chatter, as they say, in the intelligence community, then we would have picked that up, correct?
Well, it's to be assumed that if there was a student that was engaged in suspicious activity, that they would be following him. But I don't think the FBI has the mandate or the resources to follow all foreign students. I mean, that would be impossible. So therefore, they would only look at students that were engaged in some kind of suspicious activity. And if that were the case, and there was a lead that came out of that investigation, then they would certainly follow up on it. But at this point, I haven't seen any of that in the reporting. I have seen no reporting that the students had anything to do with it this time.
Yeah, what's the other sort of domestic possibility which some media outlets have been talking about, namely kind of a homegrown type of scenario where, given it's Patriots Day in Boston, it's the finish line of the you would have to know the city fairly well to pull something like this off without tipping anybody, right? Overtly.
Well, I think that has also been speculated, that it could be a homegrown terrorist.
Yeah. And
with any number of grievances. There's all kinds of grievances that would lend yourself to this kind of extreme, violence. That has nothing to do with, outside, sponsorship, foreign sponsorship. But again, at this point, we really don't know.
Now, Brian Jenkins, I think you mentioned earlier in the prep, when we were prepping for the interview, another RAND terrorist expert suggests that perhaps, if he was to push about a theory, he would suggest that it's potentially domestic.
I think he's given some interviews where he says that given the little that we know at this point, his gut feeling is that this is most likely a homegrown, an act of homegrown terrorism. But again, he caveats that observation. Because again, we really don't know. I mean, for example, when Timothy McVeigh did his bombing of Oklahoma, of the federal building, at that point, are we still on?
Yes, we're on.
Oh, okay.
I can hear you.
All right, let's start over again. All right, cut. Start over again.
No, we're good. I can hear you. You were talking about Timothy McVeigh.
Yeah. Let's remind ourselves of the case of Timothy McVeigh and then why it's hazardous at this early point to speculate. The media initially did make a Middle Eastern connection. And I remember seeing on television myself where they showed a bombed out building in Beirut and then they showed out bombed out building in Oklahoma.
I see.
And they said, look, they look the same. So obviously it was the same kind of bomb. It's the same kind of terrorist group. So the media was making that connection right off the bat in the very first moments after that terrorist incident. But as it turned out, as we all know, those people that wanted to make a Middle Eastern connection proved to be totally wrong. It was a homegrown terrorist. It was Timothy McVeigh, who had his own grievances. It had nothing to do with the Middle East.
Okay.
Now, this is not to say that this case is not a Middle Eastern case. It might be. All I'm saying is it's just too early to speculate.
Right. No, I mean, obviously if we follow kind of the Times Square bomber line of thinking, a heavily populated public space, a public square where a lot of people are going to be there, you can cause, massive damage, et cetera. Obviously, this person was thinking in that kind of a, twisted mindset to damage, in this case, obviously, young kids, family members, spectators, and bystanders.
Well, yeah, obviously. I mean, obviously, whoever did this wanted to kill the maximum number of civilians, of innocent people, purposely. I mean, by the type of bomb, and we did see all kinds of amputations of the result of this. All kinds of carnage has resulted, and then not only did he want to kill a lot of innocent people and maim a lot of innocent people, but he also wanted to do it in a public venue that would get as much attention as possible. Obviously, whoever did this wanted a lot of attention. I mean, the Boston Marathon is a worldwide event. The whole world is now looking at this event, and that's what the perpetrator wanted. He wanted worldwide attention, and he got it. Now, the question is, who is this perpetrator or this group? It may not be an individual. It could be a group. Right. We don't know.
Right. Now, is it the case that generally Islamic terrorists take responsibility for, try to take sort of credit for and responsibility for acts such as these?
Yeah, frequently they do, but that's not always the case.
Okay. Now,
and
you've just come from Afghanistan.
The thing is,
Yep.
Go ahead.
No, you've just come from Afghanistan, because originally we were going to interview you about your trip to Afghanistan, that you were there for, I think you said a week at least, maybe 10 days, at the end of March, and into the early part of April. So we were going to actually, slightly pivot towards that. Obviously, suicide bombers, as we've seen in Kabul and other places, have tried to kind of wreak havoc in the Afghan Valley recently. There have been several instances of it. Obviously, this was not a suicide bomber. But I mean, obviously, given your experience, do you find any kind of insight and parallels here?
It's too early to tell because, Taliban terrorism is politically driven. They have a political agenda that they're trying to achieve through terrorism. The perpetrator of this recent terrorist attack in Boston, we don't know if he's got any political agenda at all. He could just be a maniac who just wants to watch people suffer. We don't know. We don't know what the political agenda is. I think the Taliban, I would say they're not maniacs. I mean, they kill people, they maim people, but they do it for a political purpose, which they calibrate very carefully. When they do terrorism, who they do it against, and it's always geared towards a political objective.
Right. Now, I think earlier when we were speaking, you potentially said that it just could be like a Sandy Hook type of loner individual who's obviously taking out his frustration on something or someone for some grievance, unknown grievance, and that possibly could be one of the scenarios that plays out here. We don't know.
That is correct. We just simply don't know.
Yeah.
It's too early to speculate.
So now, in terms of Afghanistan, extensive trip. You were there at the end of March, right? In early April.
In March, actually.
Yeah. So FT is reporting yesterday that as foreign troops prepare to leave, Afghans fear that locally trained troops will not contain the Taliban. So everybody, this is a fairly extensive story in Financial Times. Everybody's afraid about 2014. They feel that 2014 will be a big change that might not be good for the Afghan people as the Taliban makes a comeback. What do you say?
Well, I think that that article is accurate. I mean, in the sense that it reflects a part of reality that does exist. I think there is a lot of anxiety. There is a lot of insecurity in Afghanistan. A lot of people do question whether or not the armed forces, the Afghan armed forces, can provide security to the same degree that NATO forces and U.S. forces did. Although that's highly debatable to what degree the NATO and U.S. forces did provide security to the average Afghan. But that's a separate discussion. But what I would like to say is that we also have to take into consideration that there's contrasting information, contradictory evidence of the situation in Afghanistan that we also need to look at, that's juxtaposed with all the insecurity. And what am I talking about? There's recent reports that indicate that the Afghan army has actually performed very well in combat against the insurgents.
Okay.
That the Afghan special forces, that their commandos have conducted raids that have been very successful against the Taliban. That some of the Afghan units are actually taking over from the U.S. and fighting very well. So that data should also be part of the equation, not just doom and gloom. We also have some positive data that should be taken into consideration.
Now, what is going to be the U.S. involvement, though, even as U.S. leaves by 2013, 2014, the drawdown takes place, a contingency force stays behind, but is the U.S. still going to be involved as trainers and advisors to the Afghan force?
Well, this is part of the great, uncertainty, because the plan calls for that.
Yeah.
The plan calls for a stay-behind force. Now, there's all kinds of discussion as to the actual number of troops that would stay. Initially, the people were talking about 30,000. Now that figure's gone down. Now we're talking 8 to 15,000 or 8 to 20,000. But whatever the actual figure is, which has not been determined, the idea was that the U.S. would leave behind a contingent to be involved in training and in providing advice to the Afghan army. Now, that is all contingent on a status of forces agreement, which hasn't been made. In other words, there has to be an agreement on whether these American servicemen that stay behind are subject to Afghan law or not, or to what degree they're subject to Afghan law. That agreement hasn't been made, and the negotiations are proceeding very slowly. So we don't know if there will be any stay-behind force at all after 2014. We want it. It is U.S. policy.
Yeah.
It is the plan. But at this point, we don't know if that plan will be materialized. And again, this is part of the great feeling of insecurity and uncertainty.
Right. So the FT article says the graveyard of empires is not a cliche. This is a Kabul-based diplomat. It's a reality. Superpowers, the US, Russia, China, Europe, and the neighbors, Iran, Pakistan, and the Central Asian states, are as worried as the Afghans. Now, of course, I think you and I have spoken about this for a number of years, and I wrote an op-ed when I was doing my earlier book on the president, that there was this, fear that as Seth Jones has said, and you've said as well, that Afghanistan, the valley might turn into yet another graveyard of empires. I don't know if you could quite say that in terms of the U.S. presence, because U.S. Forces have been effective in beating back Al-Qaeda Central.
Well, yes, they've been effective, and the Russians were effective too. I mean, the Russian Spetsnaz were very good. The Russians did many, operations that were very effective against the guerrillas. And you could argue that the main reason why Russia withdrew from Afghanistan was political and economic. And it wasn't military. You can make that argument. As a matter of fact, in my recent trip to Afghanistan that you referred to, I talked to some old Mujahideen commanders, and I asked them. I said, well, because they were talking about how ruthless the Russians were when they were fighting, and I asked the question, well, they did lose the war, so what mistakes did they make? You know, thinking, well, maybe we should avoid them. We should avoid the mistake that the Russians made. That's why I asked that question. And it really surprised me greatly that one of the Mujahideen commanders said, you know, they weren't defeated. They just ran out of money.
I see.
So the fact that you're effective in a battle and you're effective in combat doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to win the war or achieve your objectives. And see that the idea of graveyard of empires, I view that more in a political sense, that these empires that went to Afghanistan did not achieve their political goals. And I think that's the way I interpret that, catchy phrase.
Now, the New York Times story today is pointing out that for the third year in a row, opium cultivation has increased across Afghanistan, erasing earlier drops stemming from a decade-long international Afghan government effort to combat drug trade, according to the UN report released on Monday. Can you comment on the opium trade that's now picked up in the last 2 to 3 years?
Well, I mean, the problem with the opium trade is that not only do the insurgents, have an interest in it, but the business community, a lot of businessmen, the commercial sector has an interest in it, the government officials. I mean, when you investigate drug smuggling in Afghanistan, it's an across-the-board activity that a lot of Afghans see a benefit in it for themselves. And as the foreign presence declines, it's kind of to be expected that in the absence of foreign pressure, that it would increase. The drug trafficking would increase. I mean, I don't find that surprising.
Okay. But is it
Is
really
so
like
many people? There's such a broad interest in having that activity because again, Afghanistan is a very impoverished place. The greatest source of revenue in Afghanistan is actually foreign donations, the NGOs, the foreign government programs. I mean, that's the main source of income of Afghanistan. It's, in fact, that's one of the issues that's been raised, that the Afghan economy has been profoundly distorted by the, billions of dollars that have poured in, from the U.S. and NATO and Japan and all kinds of foreign donors. Have poured in billions of dollars to the point that that's actually the main source of revenue. But, that's artificial. That can't last forever. And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a transition to where the Afghan economy is going to be more real. As they're going to have to live based on their own resources and what they produce and what they can do. And now there's a lot of talk about the mining sector and precious metals and all kinds of things that will be exploited in the near future, but that hasn't happened yet. So then when you look at the economic possibilities that Afghanistan has currently, well, the main one is poppy cultivation. So it just stands to reason it would go up.
I see. So, but I'm glad you brought that up. Just talk about the development story though, a bit, because education has shown an improvement. Girls' education, school attendance has shown an improvement. There is an improvement in infrastructure, certainly in the cities. And so, so that part of the narrative obviously doesn't necessarily come through as clearly. And we've spoken about this before as well. But I'm speaking specifically about, let's say, getting kids back to school or having safe roads to travel on. And there has been an improvement in that, development story in Afghanistan.
Yes, absolutely. And see, this is part of what I said at the beginning of this interview, that in Afghanistan you have very contradictory data. going on simultaneously. You've got the doom and gloom scenario. You've got all the things that argue for a pending civil war and so forth, and backsliding and women's rights and all these issues. On the other hand, you've got positive developments, which are undeniable, such as what you have just mentioned. There's no question that over the last decade, education for children has improved. Education for women has improved. Healthcare has improved. There's a lot of very specific indicators of improvement. Afghanistan today is not what it was when the Taliban fell. And now this education of the young people, there's a good part and there's a bad part to that. The good part is that you do have kids that are educated, that have expectations of a better life, that want a better life. I think these educated kids are not likely to be Taliban followers, all right, because the Taliban represents going back to the past. These kids want to go to the future. That's the good part. What is the bad part? That the Afghan economy has not created employment for all these. This is a typical third world problem, by the way. This is not just Afghanistan. I would say this is common in many countries, where you have an overabundance of educated young people and the economic system does not provide employment to meet their expectations. And I think that is actually a different source of tension that you're going to see in this society increasingly over the next few years. And this has nothing to do with the Taliban.
Right. This is the secular development story, transition obviously from many, many years of war to a civil society. And of course, in the meantime, all of the intellectuals, sort of the public, representatives of a representative democracy and civil society have left, right? They've basically fled Afghanistan because of years of war.
No, but I would caution with that assumption, because yes, your statement is correct. A lot of have fled, but a lot have not fled. And I actually, one of the features of Afghanistan today is that you do have a lot of civil society activists in Afghanistan who are pushing in Afghanistan for this progressive agenda, and they haven't left. And see, this is one of the big unknowns. What is going to happen to these people, when the foreigners, no longer dominate, after 2014, when it's going to be Afghans completely in charge of their destiny? Will all these civil societies and these activists be allowed to function, or will they all come under pressure? That remains to be seen, but they're there.
Right. Okay. Interesting. But I'm just referring to another story that I saw yesterday from Gulf News, and I'm going to ask you about it, which basically states Afghanistan is now at this time, at this sort of delicate moment, is being held hostage by warlords, and that the use of strong men to fight Al-Qaeda and Taliban has fragmented the tribal system and made civil war, as opposed to a civil society, more likely after the U.S. forces leave.
Well, that's a powerful argument. I actually was discussing this issue with American diplomats and American personnel, government personnel who actually were in Afghanistan in 2002 at the time of the emergency Loya Jirga, which has signaled as the event in which the warlords formally returned. And that period, the 2002 period, has been described as the period when the warlords formally reestablished themselves. And then what we're seeing today is a result of that. And now you have just given the negative interpretation of it, which I think, is a compelling argument. But just for the sake of balance, the argument that the diplomats say for including the warlords in the beginning was that if you had not included them, that you would have made the possibility of a civil war back then more likely. that the warlords, because they were organized, because they did have armed force, if they were excluded at that time, that they would have reacted violently, and then you would have had a second armed confrontation. Following the one with the Taliban, you would have had one with the warlords. Now, that's the argument that's made. You know, I'm not suggesting that I adhere to that argument, but the whole idea of including warlords has been an attempt to bring them into the system in order to avoid the separatism and the civil war that you've seen in the past.
Okay. So now obviously Taliban has an office in Doha. They've been recognized with a representative that, you know, I guess with an office and a phone number where you can call. The Taliban, you know, as part of the agreement, has a presence in Doha, Qatar.
Yes. What about it?
Okay. So any negotiations that take place with the Taliban, there is a representative or, you know, somebody who speaks for the Taliban, and that's where we go. I mean, to talk to them. Is that how it operates?
Well, that's the idea, but to me, it doesn't matter if it's in Doha or where it is. I mean, the venue to me is less important than what you're going to talk about.
Okay.
And what I have seen is that nobody is interested in seriously talking at this point.
I see.
You know, the Taliban don't seem to be in the mood to make concessions. The Karzai regime it doesn't seem to be in the mood of making concessions. The U.S. hasn't signaled what it wants, has not signaled, in my view, a very clear negotiating position. So we've gone through the preparations for a negotiation, but I don't see any evidence that serious negotiations are taking place. I'm not sure that the top Taliban leadership at this time even wants serious negotiations. I mean, I know lots of district level Taliban commanders most definitely do want negotiations. I actually think among the rank and file Taliban, there's a lot of yearning for peace and for ending the war. But I don't see that reflected in the top leadership.
Okay.
And then you get the ISI component. To what degree does the ISI want a genuine peace to happen? So we go through all this show of having negotiations, but I don't think the basic elements for a serious negotiation are there.
So this is a report that you're going to be putting together, right, from your trip that's going to be released soon, hopefully.
Well, the main thrust of the report that I went there to do is on reintegration.
Okay. And when is that going to be? When is that going to be coming out through RAND? It's a RAND report, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
But first it has to be turned into the military. You know, it has to be, the way the system works is we turn in the report to the military, and then they decide whether or not it goes public.
So, Dr. Munoz, so in terms of the Boston, going back quickly, because we have a couple of minutes, actually less than a minute left, going back quickly to the Boston thing, how do you think this is playing out? Several months, maybe a year before we find out what exactly happened in Boston?
Oh, no, it shouldn't take a year. I mean, we should know hopefully in several weeks, I hope.
Given the resources we've spent on intelligence in the past 10 years.
Yes, I think we have a much greater investigative capacity than we had in the past.
Right. We're out of time. Thank you for joining us at Princeton TV. Tune in again for another edition of Asian Times TV. Thank you, Dr. Munoz.